Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Meltwater Finals, part of the Champions Chess Tour. The weirdest format of any event that we've ever seen, as Magnus Carlsen and Wesley get bonus points into the initial seeding. Now, this is day number 2. All the matchups that I'm going to cover today, I'm going to get through in about 5 to 6 minutes. I'm going to summarize what happened in a lot of them, and then we are going to watch Magnus Carlsen and Shakhriyar Mamediyarov beat the crap out of each other. They played 7 games against each other today, and all 7 of them had a winner. There were no draws, so I want to dedicate basically the entire recap to them because the boys deserve a lot of credit. First, we're going to start off with Hikaru, Nakamura, and Timur Rajabov. They forced 4 draws in their games. 4 draws in the first 4 games, basically all forced by repetition. The internet exploded. Please let me know what you think in the comments, because the more comments means the more engagement on the video. Yeah, like, everybody was really mad. I thought it was really funny, and then Hikaru won a blitz game. Giri Duda, this is the final game of their rapid portion. So you play 15-minute, and then obviously there's blitz. And this game was, I mean, there's some weird maneuvering in the opening, but completely symmetrical game. So D pawns, right? They traded their C pawns. And what we're going to get us, I just absent-mindedly hit the forward arrow, is we're going to see a little bit of a transformation of a pawn structure, right? C6, D5. So now you could think that this square is up for grabs, maybe something on the C6 pawn. Black will try to mobilize this way as long as they don't blunder a rook. And Giri plays this game in a very interesting way. First of all, Duda pushes his H-pawn and then castles, which just breaks all the principles. Anish plays the move E5, and they have a big trade in the center, leaving him with something known as the hanging pawn structure. The more pieces that white trades against the hanging pawn structure and the less mobility they get, and the more successful a blockade you get of those hanging pawns, you're going to have a good time. And Anish is going to really struggle because he can't push his pawns forward, so white is just clearly better here from a structure standpoint. And, well, all Duda does for the rest of the game is just try to stockpile as much pressure as possible against these pawns. What Anish does is he goes for kingside counterplay. So the way you offset having positional weaknesses is you try to create dynamic counterplay. Okay, so there's something called statics and dynamics. If you're below 2,000, you don't need to know what that is, and 98% of my audience is below the rating of 2,000, so you don't need to know what that is. So basically, I just said something that you don't even need to listen to. Welcome to my videos. So, yeah, the blockade continues. You know, Duda's doing a really nice job, but Anish's counterplay is coming in. He just mishandles it a little bit, and now that the queens are off the board, it's going to be really difficult to successfully try to create some play. And again, the game is just really easy for Black. Black just plays against these 2 weak pawns. So even if there's equality for a long time, at some point, you're just... one of your pawns is going to wander too far into the wrong neighborhood, and it's going to get clapped. And you see, like, when one guy pushes all his pawns in an endgame, and one guy pushes almost none of his pawns, the guy who's pushing his pawns is probably going to lose his pawns. And the guy who's pushing his pawns ends up losing his pawns. He loses both of them, so now he's down 2 pawns. Now, it's bad to be down 4-2 in an endgame. And Duda spends the next 38 moves converting this endgame as Anish kind of tries to create some play. It's going to take a long time, but trust me, the guy with the 2 extra pawns is most likely going to win, unless that guy is, you know, a Gotham subscriber. Now he's up 3 pawns, and now he's even at a point where, yeah, you see, he can sack his rook. Like, I know it's check, but he can actually sack his rook and still win, because he has all his pawns together. He chooses not to sack his rook. Shocking. And we shuffle, shuffle, shuffle. Anish so disrespectful, not resigning against his opponent. Oh, wow. Well, wow. Okay, now he resigns. Now and only now did Anish think that Duda was going to win. I'm kidding. Anish is not disrespectful. Everybody calm down. So, Duda wins a really nice game and actually wins the match in rapid. Gets off the 0-point mark because Duda had no points. He got no bonus points in the initial seeding. Levon versus Artemyev, this is their final rapid game. Very interesting opening. This is like very, very non-standard. You normally have bishop c5. And we get a queenless middle game. Now, both these pawns are hanging, so what do we get? We get none of those pawns getting captured. And opposite side castling. So white is a little bit better here and decides to, you know, attack the e5 pawn. As Artemyev tries to create some queenside counterplay, playing, you know, fianchettoing his knight. Again, it's one of those things when he does it, it's like, wow, such refined positional play from the Russian Grandmaster. And when you do it, I'm like, are you high? Like, did you smoke weed before you played this game? No? Then I don't know what you're doing. So bishop g3 attacks the pawn. Like what's he doing? What is this? What is that? And yet it's actually fine. Black is, according to the engine, slightly better here. No joke. Look at this. Look at this maneuver. putting his knight where it looks like it can be taken. Some big brain maneuvers here. Gets the c6 pawn, but Artemiev gets open bishops. So you take a pawn, but you open up the floodgates for the enemy bishops. But it's actually very tricky because if you take on e4, you're going to lose b5. And if you play a6, trying to defend, then I jump in here and you're going to lose more stuff. And again, as we learned from last game, being down 2 pawns is probably bad. In this case, Aronian is just up 1 pawn. Look at that. Look at this. Simplifies for the bishop and then breaks because the king is in the center. You can still learn stuff from these games. Look at this. Just disrespectful. I mean, just making moves that just don't look possible. Brings his knight back to f3. He wants his opponent to take so that he can take this, and that's it. Like I said, you know, being up multiple pawns at this level is probably going to win you the game. And this game, Aronian was up between 1 and 3 pawns at all times, and even was threatening various checkmates, even giving up material, still up a pawn. There's all sorts of check threats. And yeah, so another endgame of rooks and horses. Just don't get checkmated. Always make sure that your king is safe. And now he won a knight, and he went on to win the game with the move king to d3. Very clean win from Aranyan. Super creative game, kind of punishing the very passive play by Artemiev, although the engine was like, ba-ba-ba, it's equal, ba-ba-ba, engine doesn't know anything about chess. Wesley So and Maxime Vacher-Lagrave. So, this one, Maxime decides to play a ready. He does not play the ready. I mean, he's 2700, he plays everything, but he doesn't usually play the ready. Usually plays e4. Now you're not going to get e4, so we're just going to have an imbalanced game. And we get an early opportunity for a queen trade, which does not occur. And then bishop f3, bishop f3. Basically, what black wants here is to block out this bishop's power with the pawns and jump the knight into the middle, get rid of the bishop entirely, and just say, you know what, I'm completely equal. And, you know, Wesley's correct. You are completely equal. But here, anytime you have 2 on 3... or a 3 on 4 on the queen side, you can create an attack on your opponent's pawn structure, especially when the kings are castled this way. Normally, it's called minority attack because you have 2 on 3, so you have a pawn minority on that side of the board. This is not quite a minority attack. It depends on the pawn structure, I think, but this you can still call it that because you have my blessing. You know, these like super professional grandmasters would be like, oh, well, actually, it's not that, blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about them. And yes, they all sound Russian. That's just, you know. b4, I love it. Beautiful play from Maxime. e4 now to kick out the queen. Rook b1, let's go. Rook b1, except it actually makes sense. And see, again, we have the same thing we saw in the Anish game, the weakness on the c5 square. So if you play c5 now, I always have knight b7, so I can hit your queen in the pawn, right? So it's going to be difficult for you to deal with certain positional weaknesses here. Wesley's choosing to ignore the weakness and just create counterplay. The problem is that, you know, between the c5 square and the e5 pawn, he has things he has to deal with. Right now, the b3 squares, look at that. Look at this. I mean, not the b3 square, the b3 knight, but look at that. You see? Now you're learning positional chess is what you're doing here. I've already spent 8 minutes on these games, by the way. I really got to get through them. All right, so, yeah, Maxime finally cashes in on that square, and we have a bishop versus knight dynamic here in this position, right? I gotta get through this game. I gotta show you those 7 Magnus games, all right? I don't want this to be a 40-minute recap. Finally, when it came time to it, some moves later, MVL decided to trade the bishop for the knight and damage the structure, and now we have a 5-on-5, but the problem is that one guy has really bad structure, and the other guy has all 5 pawns together happily standing around. So as this game progresses, Maxime finally slides over to h5, and yeah, well, that's gonna be a problem. So he takes... and then he hunts Wesley's king out into the open. And it's going to be mate pretty soon. And here Wesley resigns because it's a combination of your king is on d4. And that's it. There's no other combination. It's just the king is on d4. I mean, this pawn's also going to become a queen. Yeah, your king can't be out here when rooks and queens are involved. The king's running butt-ass naked through a field as people are shooting cannons at each other. Some people would be into that. I don't know. Anyway, MVL beats Wesley So. That's actually pretty shocking. Wesley So was the front runner, so, you know, MVL, big point gain in the standings. But now it's time for the main event of the evening, so... all right, Shahryar Mamediyarov, Magnus Carlsen, here we go. We get a weird King's Indian. I mean, this is not normal. You're not supposed to play the pawn to c5 so early because it can get taken. And... normally, the way you try to get this back is you try to play knight a6, knight c5, but Magnus goes queen a5, so he's trying to play some exotic stuff. And then this dude, I don't care if he's the world champion, bro, he takes on c4. He takes on c4. And a couple of moves later, this dude took on a2. This dude took the a2 pawn. So what did Shak do? Attacked the queen again, then played rook a4, then played knight takes f6, and this. And Magnus lost the piece on move 13. Magnus has 2 bishops, and the other guy has 2 bishops and a knight. Now, Magnus does have 7 pawns. He has 7 pawns for the 5 pawns. But, actually, 4 pawns. It's 7 pawns to 4 pawns. But the problem is that these pawns are doubled, and pawns just are slow. You can have 3 extra pawns, but they're not going to create sufficient counterplay. So Mamedyarov spends the remainder of this game just consolidating his position. Magnus trades queens. Rook c1, nice move. Again, the more you trade and leave your opponent with dumb structure, the better it's going to be. Magnus, of course, doesn't go for that. a5. Woo! But it's not gonna work. The rook is gonna slide to a6 and hit every single pawn that you have. Also, I'm threatening mate in some positions. So rook a6, and Mamedyarov just takes the a7 pawn and is like, yeah, I'm gonna get a5 too. This game goes on for a little bit. And, you know, he's Magnus Carlsen, but he's not going to win this. You know, his pawns are going to get hunted down, and Mamedyarov just wins. I mean, an opening catastrophe. Shocking, you know, if you spend 3 of your first, like, 12 moves just hunting pawns with your queen, actually more than 3, right? It was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 moves. 6 of your first 11 moves. Yeah, don't do that. Sometimes the world champion is good to follow and sometimes not. So Mamedyarov wins game number 1. We go to game number 2. What is Magnus going to do with the white pieces? Well, we got to go to El Clásico. You got to play Ruy Lopez, right? If you're going to win a chess game and assume your status as the world champion, you got to play Ruy Lopez because you just moved your queen 6 times in the first 11 moves. Magnus is like, all right. So I know that Shakhriyar likes to play this line where you take on e4. This is known as more of the open lines, right? It's not a closed maneuvering line. It's going to be an open line. d4, now b5 and d5. This is a very dynamic way to play the Ruy Lopez. And after you take on e5, black develops on e6 to close the center, develops the bishop actively on c5, and, takes on f2. Which is not a move that you really think makes a lot of sense, because after rook takes f2, bishop f2, and king f2, white has 2 pieces for a rook and a pawn, and that's good, like 9 times out of 10. So in this variation, black actually threatens to open the f-file. It's a very dynamic system, and now takes, and this actually looks really nice for black. Like, optically speaking, this looks really good. So Mamedyarov's got a really nice position. He gets all aggressive, but Magnus calls his bluff. He's like, yeah, go ahead and take on f3, dude. Come on. Take on f3, open up my king. You want to open up my king so bad? Open up my king. What are you scared of? Open up my king. You want to go there? Open up my king. And then Shak's like, yeah, no, I'm good. I actually don't want to do that because I got too many weaknesses. Your bishop is going to come alive. I regret playing bishop g4. And he's like, all right, well, time to activate my dark squared bishop. Look at this move. That's a cool move. The bishop just hangs out among all the other pieces. Guards this, pressures this, can't be blocked out with b4. But Mamedyarov's got an aggressive position. He plays d4. d4 is a kind of move that you play like, I just beat the world champion in like 12 moves. I don't give a damn about who he is. I'm going to play d4. Let's get this dub. And then you get hit with a very quick queen d3. And he tries to mate you, forcing you to retreat. And then he just activates his knight. And you're like, why is my rook hanging out with all these horses? This is kind of an example of, white is down material. White is not down. I mean, white's down a point of material, a pawn of material, but he has more pieces. He has 2 knights and 2 bishops playing. I can't really say what black has playing, and your king's very weak. So Shak plays this move, best move. Now bishop goes back to a3 because he doesn't want to lose it. And again, Shak's position is finally coordinated, but like not really. It's like right on the verge of collapse. He moves the rook back to e6, and it's like, how are you going to defend this? And the problem is, once this disappears, do you see what these bishops are going to do to this king? It's going to be brutal. If your children are watching this with you, I would advise you to speak to them about the consequences of violence, okay? Because it's about to get violent. Knight takes d4, queen c5, knight e4, kicks the queen out again, and now queen e3. It's the longest introduction to violence, but I promise it's going to happen. Queen c3, you still can't take. I mean, first of all, you'd lose this, but obviously at the end, if you took again with the queen, you would get mated. It's bad. It's not good. The engine still gives some ludicrous defenses here, like h5. Shut up. c4, you know, Shock's doing his best. He plays h6, which is kind of h5, but not. But yeah, I mean, Magnus just continues to pile on the pressure, and yeah, knight f5, and I mean, the queen has 2 jetpacks behind her. Like, this is not going to be good. So, Shock does his best. He chooses the non-violent path, but the problem is that the endgame is just losing. Like, all endgames here are lost. Here, there's rook e1 check, but then king f2, so that doesn't work. And, I mean, this looks like mate. It's not. It's close. And Magnus has to win slowly, but he gets the job done. He gets the job done. Nice little, look at that move. Nice little flick in at the end. If takes, then this. And he wins. Magnus strikes back. 1-1. All right, game number 3. Shock with the white pieces. This time Magnus does not play the g6 pawn. He plays e6, and we get a Rogozin. Rogozin is an incredible opening with white with black. Super interesting, super dynamic. And we have bishop g5 and this line where you take on f6 and play e3. Solid line by white, but pretty equal, like pretty equal. But rook c1. And now we're going to get takes, and a center explosion. But then this line is a little bit more dynamic, knight e4. Shock doesn't take back with anything, instead choosing to move the knight out of the pin to attack the queen. Black goes back to e7. Shock plays knight takes d4. So white has a nice looking position. White's got like all the pieces in the center, maybe queen h5 or queen g4, something in the future. Put the rooks on the open lines. a3, always useful to kick this bishop out somewhere, and black is obviously a little bit lagging in development, so he needs to get his pieces to the party. Bishop e2, knight c6. There are the pieces coming to the party, and now the knights are going to try to jump in on the dark squares over here. Queen d6, which is just a fancy way of jumping in with the knight on the dark squares on d6 or c5. b7 is weak. Magnus Carlsen defends it. Shock plays rook d1. Okay. Nagging pressure for the white side. Rook d8. I told you the knight was going to jump to c5. Magnus decides to trade. The problem is in this position that it's just depressing to play with black because you can't move many pieces at all. So Magnus starts bringing his king because that kind of makes sense. You can't really do too much else. Here comes b4. Anytime you have an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, which you have right now, white's army is super powerful. Black's army is like, oh my god, you can't get through, but we can't really do much. There's going to be a tipping point. That tipping point could be a pawn break, could be a trade of pieces. So Magnus keeps going back, but now e4. e4 is a nice move, just taking away squares. Magnus does a good job here. He hits the rook d3, knight c6 back, and now f4. You see Shock's just adding more and more and more. Rook is kicked out, but now you've weakened your position a little bit, and these pieces are going to have a tough time defending each other. So Magnus plays e5. Look at that's a nice move. That is a professional move. You got to be like 2600 to know that bishops go backwards. And after this, he takes the knight instead. That was the problem. Magnus got a little antsy, played b6, weakened c6. You got to save the bishop. Now e5 is going to fall. But first, we have to threaten all the other pawns. Pawn takes f4. You could play rook d7. He could have played this. He didn't want to because if you're trying to win an endgame with rooks and knights, trade a pair of rooks. That's the golden rule. Only one. If you trade 2, you could make a draw. But if you keep 2 rooks on the board, there's a lot of chances for counterplay. Right? So he doesn't want to trade the rooks. He tries to go for this, but now f7 falls, a7 falls, and a few moves later, yeah, I mean, g7 falls. How does g7 fall? Well, because this rook is not guarded anymore, so check and here. But Magnus got his wish. He got a little bit of counterplay, which is all you need in a rook endgame. Because you can use the counterplay to then make a draw, right? To save an endgame, which is what Magnus is really good at. He's really good at just hitting you with soul-sucking counterplay. Right now, he's trying to make Mamedjarov like blunder something, but Mamedjarov is sharp, and he does trade off into a rook endgame, but he does it at the right moment and in the right way. Why is this the right way? because he's guaranteed to win a pawn. And he does this. And this is winning. Because you have a 3-on-1. You have a 3-on-1, and the king can sneak around the pawn. It's a 3-on-1 endgame. It was very important. He turned his e-pawn into an f-pawn. And look at that. That's professional. GF might actually screw up your advantage because you split your structure. This is smart to then in the future always be able to play rook f4, rook f3, or just do it like, you know, he's trying to do it in this game with these pawns. I mean, actually, can we go back for a moment? Why did he not play rook f4? Ah, because maybe he thought that the pawn was going to promote. Okay, so he decided not to do it this way. He decided to do it like this. And, okay, he won, but apparently the engine gives rook b2, king f3, rook b3 as a draw? King e4, rook g3? Engine, what are you saying? Wow, this is a draw? Wow, this is a draw. Yeah, so there you go. Magnus actually created sufficient counterplay to make a draw. The problem is that probably he got into time trouble and white's pawns got too far advanced. Yeah. I mean, he did it. The madman actually created enough confusion to make a draw, but on move 50 of a rapid game wasn't able to do it. Mamedyarov wins this one. Let's go to game number 4. This is the final rapid game. Magnus Carlsen needs to win it in order to force a blitz playoff. And since there's 7 games, I mean, you're not stupid, right? But how did he do it? A6 Queen's Gambit declined. The critical way to play against this is to play an exchange variation with CD, ED, Bishop F4, and basically just argue stupid, why did you play A6? This move doesn't make any sense. So, E3, C5, and committal move by Mamedyarov to play C4. So, we're going to have a locked structure now. Castles, Bishop G5. Trying to take, and take. So we get Bishop E6, and now Knight E5. Are we going to get F4? What are we going to get? Are we going to get Bishop F3, Queen C2, Rook C1, B3? What are we going to get? Takes on F6. Well, because Mamedyarov moved his queen out of the way. Yeah, this Mamedyarov is like, the way he plays in this match is like, okay, he wins a game, now he's going to go completely ballistic, right? So Knight A4. Trying to go for dark squares on the queen side and see what you're going to do with the pawns here. Self-explanatory. By the way, this dude just castled after opening his king. Queen C2. Takes on C4. Takes A3. I'm telling you. Look at what Mamedyarov did. He has 4 pawn islands. 2 of them are doubled and isolated. Huh? So now Magnus is just a pawn up. And Mamedyarov's like, bro, I don't care, man. I want to play more games. I don't even want to knock you out. Look at that move. Why is he not playing queen takes c5? Because he doesn't want to lose the a6 pawn and just be a clean flank pawn down in an endgame with a really bad structure. Like, the structure here is always lost for black. So rook d8, and he does end up taking. And a couple moves later, Mamedyarov loses the c6 pawn as well. But kind of puts Magnus's bishop in a little bit of a pickle, if you will. But the bishop's going to make it out. If you play rook d8, there is check. And if rook d8, there's queen c4. So the bishop just finds a way to get out. The bishop does get out. And, I mean, Carlsen's like a contortionist. Look at this. He escapes completely. He has to lose the a-pawn. But he plays bishop takes f7. And this looks like a successful trick, because if you take, there is this. But black goes king f8. And, like, I don't know how Magnus is doing this. If queen f7, there's queen e4. If bishop d3, this attacks the rook, and that actually would have been really nice. Schach does this, though. And then this. But the problem is that this endgame is not as good. This is a 3-on-2 queen and rook endgame, but because he's got weaknesses and a weak king, it's going to be really tough to defend. So what does Magnus do? Doesn't allow the rook to rotate over by playing the move h4 and starts to activate his rook and brings his pawns up. He's not so afraid of rook g8 check because he thinks that he can just slide his king out of danger. Black does have sufficient counterplay here, but it's really tough to play this accurately. And now Magnus plays this. And you cannot take the e4 pawn. But Shahryar takes the e4 pawn and loses. It's not the check up close that kills you. It's the distant check. Why? Any king move runs into a rook or the blunder of a rook. So, for example, king to e7 runs into check and some sort of rook infiltration. King f8 runs into rook d8 check, and king here runs into, well, king g6 you would just take for free, and queen e6 runs into, boom! So, 2 bloody endgame wars, and Mamedyarov blunders at the very, very end, the tactical endgame, giving Magnus Carlsen a 2-2 tie. Let's play some blitz. All right, the good news, the blitz games were a little bit shorter, because they're blitz games, so they're completely all over the place. So we're not going to be sitting here for 20 more minutes. It is 2-2, and we have... How many times do I have to teach you this lesson, old man? All right, back to what worked. This time Magnus takes. Actually kind of surprising, like Magnus played e3, but this time Magnus is like, I'm going to call your bluff. Takes on c5. So obviously if you take back queen d5 and white just wins the game, I mean, this is just really bad. Maybe even knight d5 is stronger, but... Knight f6. So he defends the center first. And now Magnus is like, well, you can't have my pawn now. I'm going to undevelop my piece and just play like nothing's happening. You just can't have my pawn. Black's like, well, all right. I mean, I'm going to get that pawn. I'm going to go for your bishop. Magnus is like, okay, I'm going to attack your queen. Here, castles, castles. You know what's funny? This position's better for black. Because white... is playing an isolated pawn position, right? When you're playing against an isolated pawn, what you need to do is control your opponent's activity and coordinate your pieces in a way that you blockade the pawn. You are not controlling black's activity here. You're not doing it. Black is about to go g5, maybe h5, I mean, take on f2, play d4. You're not doing any of the stuff you need to do against an isolated pawn. Magnus plays knight e1. Why is he playing knight e1? Because he's trying to reroute, obviously. And you don't need to give Shahryar an extra excuse to play the move g5. He plays g5, kicks his bishop back to d2, and plays bishop to a7. He played bishop to a7 to sidestep this. Always the bishop can come back to b8. Just good to like move the bishop out in a lot of these isolated pawn positions. Knight d3. And now is like, okay, black has advantage, so what does he do? What does black do? Knight e5. Okay, makes sense. Knight takes. Gotta take with the f pawn, right? Yep, to open up the rook. Now queen b3. Queen b3 hits both pawns. But of course, you're not going to take with the queen, so it walks into knight a5 and knight c4, which now attacks the bishop. The bishop goes to e1. Now, this is a bad position for white. I get he's the world champ, but you're getting sniped from across the board. Just compare the quality of bishops, and that's all you need to know about this position. How does black now make the next step into white's position? By playing the move e4. e4 is a really nice move. It completely separates this bishop from reality. E3 can happen at any moment to now continue to attack. I mean, it's just a good move. The knight can now rotate out. But Magnus plays queen b3 again now. And this is the moment of truth. Black has to find a maneuver here. Queen d7 to guard this. And then something with queen f7. So let's say something like a3, queen f7. And it becomes extremely difficult to guard this. But there's also queen h5, bishop h3, and you just go all in on the king side. There's also queen h5, rook f6, rook h6. And actually, white is just not equipped to stop that plan. Like, the combination of all of these different ideas is so strong. I mean, you need to make sure that white can't just get in on b7 and beat you up. But black's position is really good, but he trades queens. He trades queens and evaluates this position as good for him. But all of a sudden, how do you guard d5? Like, how do you guard d5? I mean, I understand you can do this, but then I'm going to go knight a4. I'm going to go for your bishop. When you get out, I'm going to kick your knight out. Right? Then I'm just going to start blockading your pawns. So, rook d1, Shock's like, well, that's easy. I just take on b2. But then we have this move. That's a shocking move. The idea of this move is that after this, the bishop is hit, this is threatened. So you go here, but all of a sudden, white has counterplay. White just has counterplay. Like, this is not clear whatsoever. So, Shock goes here with the intention of this, and just simply blunders, rook takes g5 check, and resigns. He resigned because he's just going to lose an exchange. I mean, he's going to lose the rook, and he's just going to be an exchange down. He just blunders. Now, the lesson here is when you have substantial pressure, and pressure particularly against a spot where the king is, don't trade queens. Don't trade queens. Just don't do it. Don't trade queens. Only bad things can happen. Don't trade queens. Also, don't get winning positions against the world champion. You're probably going to get nervous. So, now Shak has the white pieces, and he plays A3 Sicilian. This is one of the, kind of crazy recommendations that I have against the Sicilian defense. It's actually in my E4 course. And after G6, normally I like to play Knight C3, Bishop C4, D3. Shak just goes here, dude. He don't give a damn who his opponent is, dude. Now we have Knight F6, E5, Knight to H5. The thing is, when you play something ridiculous against the world champion, he might respond by letting you play something ridiculous right back. And now we just have a circus. I don't know what is happening here. H5 blunders a second pawn, by the way. That's just hanging. So, I mean, I know white is going to get an initiative, but it's just a totally insane position. Magnus takes on H5. Knight takes D4, looking for Knight F5, so black needs to prevent that, or else white is just going to get a really strong position. E6! If you take on D4, I take on F7. If you take Queen H5, you're dead. Or I don't know, maybe you have King D7 and survive. But Queen A5 check, Knight C3, Bishop E6, Rook takes H5. What? What? I mean, this looks like two dudes just pounded shots the whole night. Now they're playing blitz. Queen B6, Knight, Rook. Aren't you glad you stuck around? Knight E6, check. Magnus still playing positional chess, damaging the structure of white. F takes E6, Queen H5 check on the way, King to D7, and now F5. This is a very tricky position for black, but black is fine. Knight D8, and now swoop, long castles, and here come the cannons. This is a really scary position, but still actually holdable for black, but scary. Rook F8. Rook C4. Here's the thing. If you play Knight C6, then I'm going to take, and are you really going to play King E6? Are you really going to play King? Are you really going to do this, though? Are you really going to do it? Look deep within yourself. You're really going to do this? And suffer, check here, check here, check here, check here. Some sort of mate. I mean, I can also check you and win your rook, but some sort of mate. Yeah, so, Magnus sacks his queen. Magnus must have thought that after bishop takes c5, rook takes f5, queen h7, rook c5, he's going to survive. And he blundered a Zwischenzug. He just blundered a check. And the point is that after this, or let's say this, this is not... You're going to lose your knight. So in the middle of a violent hunt on his king, Magnus just blunders a check. And his king is going to get hunted to death now. That's a beautiful move, rook d7. Sneaking in behind, and now queen d5, and there's probably going to be some mate, or you're going to lose every pawn that you have. And yep, that's exactly what we get. But also we can trade rooks to get a winning endgame, but now we're going to take every pawn the world champion has. And look at that move. Take my rook so I can check you and win your rook, and this is easy. This is easy because if the queen has pawns that are helping, you just can't coordinate to stop it. So give it a little bit of time, but Shak slowly advances his g-pawn and wins. It's 3-3, and now we have an Armageddon. And in the Armageddon, Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces and 5 minutes on the clock. Mamedyarov has the black pieces and 4 minutes on the clock. And if black draws the game, black wins. So here we go. Why does this dude keep doing this? I mean, last game he actually got a pretty good position. So what are we going to get this time? Oh, no c5. He doesn't play c5. He doesn't play c5. Now, bishop g5 is another way to put some pressure like this. So normally people go c6 here. Shakhriyar is keeping the option to play c5. He really likes to play c5. The guy likes to play c5. What are you going to do about it? f4. This is known as the Stonewall setup. And the point of this is that you're going to trade this bishop. This happens a lot in the Trompowsky. You're going to trade this bishop and plant the knight on e5. And the problem piece in the Stonewall is the dark squared bishop, but it's gone. Or a light squared bishop if you play with black. And then here, yeah, Shak goes wild. g5. That is a fun move. Here's the idea. You sacrifice a pawn, but you have the h2 pawn hanging. Now, for some reason, Shak does this first. I don't quite get it. I don't know why he didn't just play rook h2. I thought that's what the whole idea was, but he plays c6. Now queen f3 with pressure. The thing is, in Armageddon, the quality of play goes down a lot because, you know, you're down a minute. There's no bonus time. So you're just kind of playing on autopilot. And yeah, long castle to defend your b2 pawn. And now I'd be willing to bet $1 million that the move knight to f4. Not mine, I'd take it out of the bank. But, you know, I'd be willing to bet that knight f4 is going to happen at some point to get this bishop. And wow, how did I know? And by the way, Magnus is still a pawn up. So same side. This is not a blunder, by the way, because danger levels, Magnus is well equipped in the art of danger levels. Some might say he even helped, you know, co-founded it with Gotham Chess. Knight takes d5. The queens were both hanging. One would fall with check. You got to take with the knights to stay attacking this. Now the bishops see each other. This is hanging. And the game ends with the following tactical sequence. Bishop takes, check, here, takes. Bishop takes d1, and check. And Mamedyarov resigned because his options are move your king, lose your rook, and play an endgame down 2 pawns against Magnus Carlsen, or block with your rook and play an endgame down 2 pawns against Magnus Carlsen. And between both of those choices, he thought neither of them was good enough, so he decided to resign. And our second day of the Meltwater Finals concludes with the following standings. Because Wesley So lost and Magnus won, these are the standings. Now, it's probably going... the Meltwater Finals are probably already decided. Magnus Carlsen's probably going to win, and Wesley So is probably going to get second place, unless Wesley beats Magnus in their head-to-head in the rapid portion and gets 3-0. Now, if you'd like me to continue to make recaps, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, you know, maybe I'll just do it a little bit more sparingly, because I don't really understand this format that much. But anyway... thanks for tuning in. I hope you had fun. Absolutely beautiful and violent chess today. And I'll see you maybe in the next ones and maybe not.